Haidong! In this video, we're going to talk about sparring rule sets. Now, obviously, as I go through them, it's going to be pretty, clear where I'm getting my ideas from. But obviously, take a look at each rule set for yourself. So again, there is no canonical federation rule set. So for now, homebrew is fine. The first rule set I'm going to discuss, and also probably the first one I'm going to dismiss generally, is going to be the Kendo or Gumdo rule set. Mostly because it does not fit the mentality of Gumdo. Gumdo in general is a self-preserving style, and what I mean by that is you usually do a lot of deflections and counters and stuff like that, as opposed to going for a straight shot, which is not what Kendo or Gumdo was developed for. Kendo and Gumdo are meant to develop a certain mindset about going all out, going out all out beautifully, and following these very strict pieces of information. So for example, in order to get a point in Kendo, again, I could be wrong because I only did like 3+ years of Kendo, but whatever. So in order to get a point, you need that fumikomi, right, which we do not do. So that's already a strike against that. Obviously you need to be able to strike a specific target area, right, so the head, the chest, the wrist, or the throat. Again, throat was reserved just for black belts, I believe, at least to the ones that I went to. And for Gumdo, we can strike more than that, right? We can strike the arms, we can strike the shoulders. In general, I would recommend don't strike the back just for safety reasons. So obviously in an actual Gumdo form, you do strike people wherever you can strike them. But in terms of sparring, I recommend not doing that. And also depending on your own school, potentially your knees, right? So because knee shots are legitimate in the Gumdo form, it's just really hard to predict for sparring. So what I recommend usually is only my black belts and above can use knee shots. Everyone else has to use normal everything up. But even that said, so we have a larger array of striking areas than Kendo does. Kendo also wants you to have that, you're announcing your cut, right? Which we don't necessarily need to do either. The second rule set's actually going to be from the Federation. So this one was never quite like official. So I'm going to keep it fairly vague just because we don't know like if it's going to come back or like whatever's going to be going on. But here are a couple ideas that were happening with the Federation style. From what I could glean, in general, like pretty much if you hit anywhere within reason, you get a point. But you do get extra points for a couple different things. So one of them was if you do a jump cut, I believe you get an extra point. Or if you do like a spin cut or something like that, you get so there are different things you can do to get even more points. But let's talk about like what kind of effect this kind of style was hoping to achieve. So if you want sparring that's going to have a lot of spins and jumps and stuff like that, that's going to be a lot more with regard to demonstrations and the more aesthetically pleasing sort of fighting. Which is not necessarily the kind of fighting that I would recommend, at least for my own students. And there's going to be a couple of reasons for that, right? So one of them was talking about with the jumping. So yes, jumping can do more damage depending on how you land and all that fun stuff. But if you do jump, you're very compromised in that position. I remember quite a few times when I've sparred people, and one of the first instincts is to jump. My favorite thing to do, kind of reactionary as opposed to something that I was thinking overtly, was stab. Right, so stab them when they're in the air, which didn't usually end well for them. So there's that kind of thing that jumping, again, can be useful, but we shouldn't necessarily encourage it in the fact that you get an extra point. Same thing with like spins and stuff like that. Spins can work depending on what you're trying to do. But again, if you try to spin just to get extra points, you're more likely to get like stabbed in the kidney, just stabbed as you're trying to spin, without necessarily being able to achieve your goal. One more aspect of it was you only are allowed to use one-handed, I believe, if you're doing a spin or a jump, which again doesn't really make much sense because if I stab you, right, so even if it's a one-handed stab, right, so if I have a nice powerful stab, if it's one-handed, doesn't really matter, right? Even if it's two-handed, right? So like if I stab you sufficiently strongly, it doesn't matter if it's one-handed or two-handed. Same thing with like spin crosscuts. We're just going in with a spin, two-hand crosscut. It's all about the same. It's all about like geometry of where it's hitting and how much power you're imparting into it. So for all those reasons, I understand where the Federation was coming from in terms of having an aesthetically pleasing kind of sparring style. But ultimately, if we're trying to think about what works in a fight, it's not going to be as useful as our third rule set that I'm going to be introducing. The third style, and the one that I recommend, is a HEMA style. So HEMA style coming from specifically Flower Point and my friends in Reading, Pennsylvania at LART. So let me give you a brief idea about what they do in terms of what counts as a like what counts as a point and stuff like that. I might be getting some things mixed up. But this is at least something that I've been using, at least for my own students, and I think is really, really helpful. And it covers all the bases that Gumdosa usually hold sacred. So first of all, at least the way that I've interpreted it, all target areas are valid, except obviously the back in terms of just like safety, and only knees, at least for my school, if you're like high enough rank. I don't think that's what they did in Flower Point, but that's something that I've added. So more or less, you hit anywhere, you get a point, right? Which makes sense, right? So Gumdosa hit everywhere. We hit the wrist, we hit the shoulders, we hit the shoulders, we hit the arm, we hit the head. Pretty much we hit anything that we can. So that's first of all one good thing, and that has one thing over Kendo. So Kendo is very specific in the target areas, versus Gumdo is a lot more free range in that kind of respect. So the two ways you can get a point, one is you just get sufficient strike with the sword, which makes sense, right? So if I strike you in the head, that should be a point, right? Likewise, if I slide half the length of my sword, that means I'm slicing into the body. That also counts. So in terms of striking, I'm going to talk about stabs in a little bit, but in terms of striking, that makes sense for us, right? So as Gumdosa, we like to do strikes, right? But we also do have drag downs occasionally. So this is another thing that's in favor of the HEMA rule set, at least in terms of sparring. Now in terms of stabs, so if we're using a flexing sword, like I talked about with the cast steel sword, if we do those stabs and it flexes, that usually is a point, or at least for, in general, if the stab was really sufficient, right, you can see that was enough force to like puncture the ribs or something like that, you obviously get a point as well. And stabs get pretty much the same point system, right, so if you pretty much like stab anywhere on the body, it still counts. And that's pretty much it. So again, I like this system because it's very simple, right? It's simple for me to internalize as a fighter. It's simple for me to internalize as a judge. And also doesn't have that much baggage that the other two systems have, right? So we don't necessarily need to have a nice ki as we do our cut, right? We don't need to have follow through. We don't need to have a stopping motion. We also don't get extra points if we do jumps and flourishes and stuff like that. It's very clear cut. Like I struck you, we're good. But that does bring me into something else that, at least again, Flower Point was talking about, that the other two systems do not talk about, which I think is pretty important. So when we spar, the ideal situation is I strike you, you don't strike me, right? Because that means I killed you, I didn't die. And that should be something that we should actually hold pretty important. In Kendo, if two people strike each other, it's usually the person who instigates as well as the one who strikes a little bit faster. That person's going to get the point even if they get hit in the process. In Gumdo, it wasn't as clear, right? So it could be if we both strike, we both get a point. But this is something that HEMA talks about, at least in Flower Point and my friends at LART, which is called doubling. So that pretty much means like if we both strike each other within a beat, there are a couple things we can do depending on what you want to do from for your own school. I forget what they did specifically in Flower Point, but if we both hit each other within a beat, and that just means like bun bun, or even bun bun, right? But it's not bun bun, right? You kind of feel that beat. So if you hit within the same beat, you either both get a point or they negate each other. And that's going to be really important for how they figure out who's like the best swordsman. Because the best swordsman is not the one who gets the most points. It's the one that gets the most points while losing the least, right? So with the least number of doubles, which makes the most sense for us because we're supposed to be allegedly on the defensive a little bit more. So that means you're striking without being struck. So I really like that concept. It's something that both of the other systems do not do, and most of the other systems I've looked into don't do as a rule set, which I think is really important. So I'd highly recommend, if you do want to do a sparring in your own school, I recommend looking into HEMA. Again, this one is specifically from Flower Point and LART in either Reading, there's also one in New York, and Lehigh Valley. So take a look at those guys and take a look at their system. In terms of drilling, what I would recommend is if you have a partner that you're more familiar with and you've done maybe a little bit of free sparring in the past, I would recommend try each of these 3 styles. Try sparring your opponent with a Kendo style and see who would win, or see what works for you, what doesn't work. Try sparring your partner with a more traditional Gumdo one with the jumps and the spins and stuff like that. And then also try it with the HEMA one with, again, all the standard kind of things that are going with that. So with that, if you have any questions, leave a comment down below. Otherwise, stay safe, stay humble, and keep training. Haidong!